We all know the world has a real issue with debris, synthetic materials, and things that are damaging to the oceans and the marine life, and ultimately us. But I've decided to focus on one small corner of the world on the Atlantic coast, and that is with Palm Beach Atlantic University. The professor of biology and oceanography, Angela Witmer, PhD, is trying to gather information on exactly that. Where is it all coming from? Because every time I go out on the beach, there's something else there. It's like things floating up, like styrofoam chunks, toothbrushes, medicinal, plastics, and it's really the water bottles too, which is my biggest pet peeve. It's just awful, and I'm just wondering what we could do about it. How can you explain what's going on, what you do in layman's terms, like for a real novice like me?
Well, I am a coastal ecologist, so I study things all the way from the dunes to the near shore reefs. So part of my studies include, of course, beaches. I did a lot of work on beaches and beach organisms, but I'm much more of a marine invertebrate. But organisms on the beach and near shore of the beach are very dependent upon the conditions around it. So we start littering, we start changing the habitat that they live in, that affects them definitely detrimentally. And so although my little critters may not be affected so greatly by large pieces of plastic, the small pieces definitely are even showing up in their digestive system. So, and those are the areas that I study frequently.
What drew you to do this in the first place?
So I was first interested in beaches via hurricanes. So hurricanes come through frequently, and I was sort of curious, like, how does this affect organisms on the beach? And so I started studying organisms and communities on beaches and the effects of just natural changes, natural disturbances that occur. So my interest in beaches stemmed from just the observation of knowing that there are animals on the beach that we can't always see. And they are affected by everything that we do on the beach. They're affected by walking on the beach. They're affected by storms that happen on the beach. They're affected by, of course, any debris that washes up on the beach. So my recent research looking at beach plastics and marine plastics that come ashore actually came from some citizen scientists, the Friends of the Palm Beaches, were noticing that there was certain types of trash that was coming ashore more frequently. And so they stopped by, being good friends, and we started talking about, hey, gathering the trash, is there something that we can do with it? Is there a way that we can collect it? Is there any scientific knowledge that we could try to understand maybe where it's coming from? Why is it coming in certain times a year more frequently? And so we started looking at that. So my expertise in beach morphology and the way the beaches look over time, and of course the organisms on the beach, sort of has helped stemming my interest into going a little further and examining plastics. And so we've been working with them. They've been collecting many different types of plastics and debris that's been washing ashore and bringing it to the facility at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And I have some coworkers that are working on other aspects, microbial work. Mine is mostly just looking at trying to understand where it's landing, possibly even trying to discern the currents and how it's getting to the South Florida beach.
Today we're going to release 250 drift cards and one GPS-enabled drifter out at one of the mooring stations for Port of Palm Beach.
We are doing this to gain a better understanding of what happens to plastics when they fall ashore, when they move through our local waters. This is all in hopes to gain an understanding of the effects of plastics in our local ecosystems.
So this is our GPS device here. So there's an email address on here. If you find it, please contact us and let us know so we can make arrangements to collect it, because we do want this one back. Wah!
The significance of this experiment is to try to really understand how plastics affect our local ecosystems, and even more importantly, how even some of this biohazardous waste affects our local ecosystems.
We have these drift cards. If anyone finds them, what they need to do is there's information on them to keep this, do not throw it back in, and to report it. There's an email address on here to report where you found it and when you found it. If these do remain in the ocean, they are biodegradable. It's marine plywood, so it will break down over time. But at the same time, we don't want to add anything if we don't have to. So if you find it, keep it. It's a nice little souvenir for you guys.
Right, is it coming from cruise ships? Is it coming from garbage trucks just throwing garbage? I mean, I saw sneakers floating up too. You know, it must be falling from somewhere. I don't think, well, I know kids sometimes throw their sneakers in the water, but it's amazing some of the stuff that floats up. And it's also fishing nets are coming up.
Very true. There's a lot of local source from this debris that's coming. We can tell that because the length of time that it's been in the water, it's obvious it hasn't been in there for a long period of time. The writings are still on the items, or just the plastics haven't shown any age at all. And then there are some other items that have been in the currents for longer periods of time, because we're finding organisms have landed on there and then are starting to have grown into adult stages. So we know it's been there for longer periods of time. Sometimes we get writings from other countries. And so we also extrapolate that that's possibly been there again. The length of time in the water and then the foreign languages clues us in that it's been probably from a different source and not just from a US litter or something that might have fallen over shore off a boat.
Right, so you never know where things are coming from yet.
It's multiple sources, we believe. And so, you know, we are trashing our own beaches when we leave, and, you know, you walk on the beach and you're like, okay, this is just something somebody's left behind. They hadn't even tried to pick it up and take it with them.
Right, you
And
think
then,
that. Right.
yeah, it's mind blowing with all this recognition, even though today we're talking about plastics and people know not to litter, but it still happens. And
Right.
that, you know, trying to change that mindset of, oh, it just fell off, I'm not going to go stoop down and pick it up. If it stayed in my bag, it would have been fine, but it didn't stay in my bag, so not my problem.
Right. So that is one of the biggest challenges, you know, helping out the marine life and beaches, is because people, do you think it's because people are not diligent and don't really care? I mean, I guess I'm kind of answering my own question. I don't know. What do you think?
There definitely is a lack of concern, but I think sometimes it just, some things get away from you, and you don't want to chase it down. Or it could be that they did just legitimately leave it behind, or maybe a late night party. There's a couple times I've been on the beach and it's obvious that somebody had a good time the previous night and maybe not have been full of their faculties whenever their senses whenever they left, to determine whether or not they should take things with them.
So what are some of the consequences if we don't solve some of these problems? I mean, in the very near future.
There's been lots of research looking at plastics and effects on many different organisms, that we're finding that there was a study done on little baby hatchlings that they found washed ashore, and every one of them had plastics in their gut. So we have organisms that are eating plastics just because it looks like regular food items. And this starts from the sea turtles, which we are very much interested in, harming them, all the way down to smaller organisms such as fish, and even the things that fish are eating. They did some recent research because some of the critters I study are little tiny bugs and worms in the sand, and you're like, oh, they're not affected by the plastics at all. But they're finding compounds that are starting out in these little tiny organisms that they are now collecting and eating. And that just means that it's going to be magnified through the food chain, even to us. And there was a researcher that did studies and did it on her own blood system and found that she had fire retardants and various different types of plastics compounds, even in her own blood system. That obviously she did not put them there intentionally, but it came from her own food. So this is harming the ecosystem, the organisms that, the megafauna that we're all excited about, down to the little things, and it harms us too.
So what is unique, if it is unique, about Palm Beach waters? I mean, like, for example, explaining the negative effects of raking the beaches. I don't know what the technical terms are, or having vehicles like the caterpillars, the trucks like raking up the sand, like down by the water's edge. I forget what you call that. And then, or even higher up where the sand is dry. So there's wet sand down by the water's edge, right? And then there's more dry sand, and the plant life, or whatever that is. I know there's another name for it, but explain to me how that affects the beaches. I mean, the water, the animals, and the marine life.
So a lot of the plants that are coming ashore that we see as very annoying plants is sargassum, gulfweed or seaweed, various different types. There's several different common names for it, but it comes from the genus the Sargassum grouping. And that species is very common. And here in Palm Beaches, we stick out just a little bit further than that other parts of Florida. So we tend to capture a lot of that seaweed as it comes through, and it comes through on our major currents. And so as we are capturing it, so we tend to get quite laden. In the last couple of years, we've had a lot of that seaweed coming ashore. And there's some research trying to understand why do we have an increased amount of that seaweed coming ashore. And it comes back down to nutrients, as there's a lot of more nutrients in the water system, which is feeding the seaweed, which causes more seaweed. And so we're finding it, of course, during certain times of year, it normally comes ashore, but we're seeing it in such grand amounts because, and the thought is the nutrient overload, nutrient pollution that's happening in our waterways. Comes from sewage outflow that occurs. It comes from excessive fertilizers that's getting washed down into the waterways. So those are the types of major sources that could drop off any that we would normally want our grasses to grow. It's the same type of nutrient that sargassum wants also. And so increasing that amount increases the amount of sargassum on our beaches. Now, we rake a lot of that up. And there are again some fun stories of studies that have looked at whether or not we should leave it behind or we should take it. It gets really obnoxious. It gets really difficult to walk on the sand. It can hide stuff, plastics. It can hide sharp objects, which can be quite dangerous. So should it be raked? That's a big question. And that a lot of municipalities have to fight, whether or not, what should they do? Leave it behind, rake it off. And with tourism, it's not a pretty sight. Doesn't smell great. And then it just washes back and forth in the water, and then the water gets all dirty and mucky. And so we end up pulling it off. And when we do that, we also can pick up some of that excessive amounts of trash that we were talking about and pulling some of the trash off. But we do pull sand too.
But but I don't know if I read this or I imagined it, but aren't there little animals, insects or whatever, living in the sargassum, like we're destroying the whole ecosystem also by breaking it up, correct?
There's not a lot that live in there, but there are some organisms that do specifically do live in the sargassum. There are specific flies, which can be a nuisance, but there are some organisms that do live in that habitat for temporary. Now, I think one of the big things that we can do as a community and as a society is start picking up after ourselves and not allow things to wash ashore, and just reducing that. There was some work that 80% of what's in the water itself comes from land sources. That's us. It's gotten washed in, it's gotten blown away. So don't let that happen. Secure everything you've got. Whatever you take to the beach, make sure you take it out, or make sure it finds a trash can on your way out. But try to be more, you reuse stuff. You know, you can buy glasses. Bring your plastic water bottle. You know, you don't have to always have a single-use plastic item. You can reuse stuff over and over and over again. That's probably one of the biggest things that we can do, is start taking care of ourselves. And then when we're there, take a little piece of the whatever is getting blown away home. Take a little plastic bag, toss it in if you find any kind of item. Because if we don't do that, it breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, and then it starts entering the food chain. And that's when, if we don't start taking care of things when it's larger, it'll start affecting us when it's smaller. Okay.
How do you see global warming affecting this? Beach erosion, things coming up on the beaches.
That's a can of worms. Global warming and the issues along with that. One of the big issues is sea level rise and sea temperature increasing. With sea level rise, we're already seeing this in Miami with the seasonal flooding becoming more and more frequent every year. But with sea level rise, organisms that are in one position, like we see in coral reefs, are eventually going to get out of their favorable zone of where they like to live. They're going to end up deeper than where they currently are. And that's going to affect the presence and absence of many different species, of whether or not they can even survive that. Will it look like on our beaches? Will it rise so much that we won't even have a beach, and all we will have our seawalls going all the way down as we're trying to protect our own development? There are some parts of the world, and even within our own country, that they're just relinquishing the shoreline as the sea level rises and comes up. They're just moving backwards. Down here in South Florida, we're sort of truncated that we can only go so far back. And if you've been to the Palm Beach Island recently, you notice that the shoreline is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. We're trying to help out as much as possible by dumping more sand on the beach to make it a little bit wider and higher. But there will be a time where it will just start getting right up to that seawall, and we'll have to start making new decisions of what is going to be best for our city and for the habitat of the organisms that live within. Because if we don't have a beach, we're not going to have the turtles.
Giving us a lot to think about.
There's a lot of topics you talked about.
Yeah, there's just so much out there. There's some saying it's like never-ending circle. And thanks for shedding some more light on the problem.
It was wonderful speaking with you.
The most challenging part about conducting the research is actually dealing with the elements, coming out on very hot days and being able to survive while you're grabbing your cores, and then coming out on very cold days. We were out during one project, it was 40 degrees, and we were having to get into the water, come back out, and do that for an hour and a half. It was very tough.